Welcome to this office hours conversation on the battle for Timbuktu. I'm James Todd with Duke's News Office, and I am here with Jen Denike, a Duke senior who studied abroad last year in Mali. Jen, thanks for joining.
Thank you.
And joining us via Skype from out in California is Bruce Hall, a Duke assistant professor of history as well as African and African American studies. Professor Hall, thanks for joining.
Thank you.
And Professor Hall, you have been researching in Mali, Timbuktu, for your book, A History of Race in Muslim West Africa, for more than a decade now. When you're reading these recent headlines about the French military intervention in the military conflict there in Mali, what's your analysis? What's the sort of context that might be missing from some of those stories?
Well, I think that from my point of view, it was relatively it was a surprise that the French intervened when they did, and largely a pleasant surprise. But I think that broadly speaking, how we understand what's happened in Mali over the last few weeks depends on where we want to start our analysis. So if we want to start with the intervention of French forces a few weeks ago, we get a story that is either a sort of liberation of half of Mali from these Al-Qaeda, Islamist, Salafist, jihadists, whatever terminology you want to use to describe them, or it's considered a kind of neo-colonial intervention, as some people have also suggested. But if we go back a little bit further, we see that there are layers to this conflict that make it more complicated and make the likelihood of the success of the French mission perhaps a little bit less clear.
So pull the lens back for us. What is there was a coup within Mali even before the French were involved.
Right. So there was if we want to go back, we could easily go back to the beginning of 2012, when a rebellion was launched in northern Mali against the Malian army and the Malian state by largely ethnically Tuareg separatists who were coming to some extent from Libya. Certainly they were using arms that were coming from Libya. And they launched a rebellion in January of 2012. And that rebellion was very effective, rendered after their arms had run out, their bullets and such, their munitions had run out. They put an enormous amount of pressure on the Malian army, unlike in previous rebellions which had occurred in that region. And one of the consequences of that pressure was a great deal of unhappiness in the army and more broadly in the Malian public. And it was a sort of accidental coup that sprang out of that unhappiness in the army in Bamako, or close to Bamako, at one of the main military camps at a town called Kati, about 20 kilometers or so north of Timbuktu. Their senior officers at the camp on a day when the Minister of Defense came to try to placate their demands and calm them down. I don't think they had any intention of taking power, but the senior levels of the Malian military and the Malian security forces more or less allowed them to. They sort of quit the field. And so a coup was, a sort of rolling coup over several days took place.
I want to bring Jen in, if I could, Professor Hall. Jen, you were studying abroad in Mali before the coup, largely in the capital, Bamako. Were these tensions present when you were there?
Not that we noticed too much. While I was there, Gaddafi was killed, so all of those things in Libya were occurring. But in the capital, we didn't really sense any tensions going on. Our families didn't really tune us into any of those kind of things that they were feeling, any dissatisfactions that they felt at the time. And
talking about our families, these are host families who are living with Malian families.
Mm-hmm. And all of them, or the majority of them, really loved the president at the time and really supported him. So we didn't really see it coming at all. Once we came back and heard about the coup, none of us really thought that was coming.
But there were sufficient tensions in the north where Timbuktu is that your group did not go there.
Yeah, correct. We weren't allowed to travel any further north than Bamako. And they told us at the beginning of the program that if we tried to travel any further north, we would have to be sent home just because we weren't going to be allowed to travel to Timbuktu.
I'm glad you all came back safe. Professor Hall, in talking about these tensions, you told the International Business Times last week that with the current conflict and the absence of a strong international security presence, it seems very likely to me that racialized violence will occur on a much greater scale than it has so far. So there were some tensions already present in Mali. Can you explain what you mean there?
Well, so there's a long history of conflict in northern Mali. It goes back, the first civil war was in the 1960s. Since even before independence was granted in 1960, there's been a lot of irredentism, a lot of in northern.
Professor Hall, I think we're going to reconnect here by Skype. Jen, I want to get back to you and talk about your experience there. What were you there to learn and study? So why did you choose Mali? It's an out-of-the-way place.
Yeah. I'm majoring here in African and African American studies and also in French. So Mali kind of seemed the ideal place to go. And also the program that I did was tailored towards global health. And I'm pursuing a certificate in global health. So it really was the intersection of all three of the things that I'm studying. And I also just knew that I probably wouldn't have this experience again to really live with a family in Africa. So I debated for a long time going to Europe or going to Mali. But ultimately I just decided that it was an experience that I probably wouldn't have again in my life.
And it looks like Professor Hall is back from California. So if you could pick up on the possibility of, you said, racialized violence.
Right. So I'm sorry to be cut off there. What I was saying is that there's a long history of this, and it's rooted in a couple of things. But one of them is that since the 1950s, there have been competing ideas about nationalism and what the shape of the political formation in northern Mali or in Mali in general should be. And from the 1950s, there were Tuareg and local Arab political forces that argued for a separation from northern Mali from what would become southern Mali. And so there was this aspiration to create a kind of Saharan territory that might, on the model of, ultimately the French concluded in the 1950s, to create a separate territory for the Tuareg because they depend on the Niger River, which runs up into northern Mali, but the majority of the people the Niger River are not Tuareg. So they're an ethnic minority within Tuareg civilians. And in the 1990s, there was a much more complicated and longer civil conflict that basically engulfed the entire region. And in that, this conflict sort of devolved into racialized violence relatively quickly. The army targeted Arab and Tuareg civilians, and many were summarily killed. There were rebels that were attacking, local black populations in various ways. And again, the Malian army was behaving in ways that were, that created an awful lot of grievances. So this is a possibility. And what's happened in the last year or year and a bit, since the collapse of the Malian state in northern Mali, is that people have chosen sides again, if you like, and things have been done that will undoubtedly there will be people that will want vengeance for those actions, and probably the greater danger, to answer your question, is that the Malian army, having collapsed in this whole region, and basically ceded it to first the rebels, and then it was taken over by the Islamists, was humiliated. And the Malian army is not an especially disciplined army. It's in especially bad shape these days since the coup in March. So without French or without other African security forces in regions of the north, it seems likely that there's certainly all the seeds are there for violent retribution.
Professor Hall, so Timbuktu is a kind of nexus point for some of this conflict because it's one of the major cities in the north where you have the Tuareg people there. So for people who only know it mythologically is a faraway place. You've been there quite a bit. Can you describe just when you enter Timbuktu, what do you see, who's there, what language is being spoken?
Most people enter Timbuktu either from they either fly into Timbuktu or they come by boat. Well, actually, that's not true. People come by ferry or by boat. But in any case, there's a road from the built out of mud and often with limestone brick. And the newer part of town, built since the colonial occupation began at the end of the 19th century, you'll find more buildings that are built out of cement. But it's a town which is largely built of mud or sort of adobe, and most of the streets are sand, really relatively fine sand. There are some trees, but it's a fairly large town, maybe 25 or 30,000 people now. It has
Professor Hall, if I could, we were able to speak with a colleague of yours, Stephen Smith, here at Duke African and African American Studies, and so he studies the region and particularly the politics of it, and was able to debrief us on the various militias that are operating in and around Timbuktu. So let's listen to this clip of Professor Smith describing the militias operating in and around Timbuktu.
You have four organized players, the ACME, the Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, which is basically an Algerian organization which went regional. Second, you would have Oneness and Justice in West Africa, also to the Western Sahara, so a more regional organization. And then you have two Tuareg organizations. One is reputed to be more jihadist, which is an organization led by someone who is definitely jihadist, but the rank and file may not be all that different from the biggest organization, which is, so this was Ansar Adin, which is the helpers of the faith, if you translate it literally. And then you would have the biggest organization by numbers, which is the independence movement, the national movement for the liberation of Azawad, the name given to the northern part of Mali.
That is Professor Stephen Smith here at Duke describing various militant groups operating in and around Timbuktu. Professor Hall, I think something that is striking about that, he lists four groups. Three of them are Islamic. Mali, a largely Muslim country, but not all the Muslim groups agree. I mean, there are multiple ones, and sometimes in conflict, and also in conflict with the way the sort of more common people practice the faith. How have you seen that played out in your research?
Well, my research has been
I think the connection there is breaking up. Jen, this is something that you noticed when you were in Mali. It's a predominantly Muslim country. How did you experience that?
I definitely saw a difference between the host families that we lived with in the urban areas in the capital Bamako, and then the families that we lived with in our village stays in the more rural areas. I think typically it seemed like to us that the families in the more rural areas tended to be more devout Muslims, and some of our families in the capital practiced kind of a more relaxed form of Muslim.
Professor Hall, Jen was just talking about that some of the families, especially in around Bamako, practice a sort of more relaxed version of Islam. Can you describe this again, the kind of backstory of the faith in Mali and how it's practiced different ways?
Well, I mean, this is a part of the world, a part of Africa, which has a very long and deep history of Islam. Islam has been present certainly in northern Mali for at least 1,000 years. One of the reasons why there are so many manuscripts in Timbuktu is because Timbuktu was an intellectual center, a teaching center of Islam going back many, many centuries. So Islam is not a foreign import so much. It certainly has a long history. It's been part of most of the cultures in that region for a long time. What I would say is that you have a tradition, if you like, of Islam, which is very much tied to practices of Sufism. And that is very widespread in Mali, has been widespread in Mali and over most of West Africa for centuries. The groups that are Islamist, and it's important to distinguish between Islamic or Muslim and Islamist or Salafist. Right? These are groups that are attempting to use a particular pared down version of of their idea of an original or an originary Islam, and contrasting that with the practice they see all around them, or the practice they identify with most Muslims in all the parts of the Muslim world. This is certainly not unique to Mali or to West Africa. This is an intellectual and political movement which is much more recent. It's really made itself felt in Mali since the 1950s. I think it's important to stress that there is a constituency in Mali for this kind of Islamist politics. It's not necessarily the people that support this or share this approach to Islam, which is effectively a political Islam, an effort to kind of make politics and life fit more closely with the precepts of Islam as they understand it. They're not necessarily violent. They don't necessarily preach jihad, so-called, but there are important segments of the population in Mali who support this kind of vision. Even in Bamako, it's not limited to the north. So we need to be a little bit careful about treating these Islamist rebels in northern Mali as if they're entirely consist of people from North Africa or outsiders. And we need to be careful of what has, this is a Malian story. What Malians sometimes say is that we have a kind of traditional and tolerant and liberal version of Islam that we practice here, and we find these Salafist Islamists to be completely foreign to our culture. That's true to some extent, but it can be overstated. There are certainly many people in southern Mali who share a kind of broadly Islamist, Salafist vision of where they should go. And I think what this reflects to some extent are tensions in Mali and other parts of the Muslim world, political tensions and social tensions as there's greater urbanization, as people are more closely connected with each other. It's much more, many more people are able to travel to other parts of the Muslim world. There's an expansion of Arabic language education in places like Mali. So it's a little bit more complicated than a traditional Islam versus a foreign fundamentalism.
And Professor Hall, so ethnicity that's suddenly in the headlines now is this Tuareg group you've mentioned. Professor Smith mentioned that. Who are the Tuaregs? We've still got you there. Okay, I think we're going to reconnect to California in a moment here. But Jen, when you were in Mali, you talked about your different interests. Okay, we're going to keep going here. You were combining an interest in global health, sort of French language and African American studies. How did you put that together in your study abroad experience?
It was really great. I had never been to Africa before that experience at all. So it was definitely a big first experience to live there for kind of 4 months for the first time. But the classes that we took were really great. We took them with all Malian professors, and a lot of the classes that we took were tailored towards learning about the Malian culture, the body image, things like that.
And since you've been there, obviously you haven't spent as much time there as Professor Hall, but you spent a semester there and made some personal connections. How have yourself and people that went with you on the trip been reacting to the news, reaching out to in Mali? So what have you been hearing and seeing?
Yeah, we definitely, the group that I went with, we definitely keep in touch a lot and share any articles that we find about Mali, any news that we hear from our host families. A lot of us have talked to our host families since being back, and they seem pretty positive about what's going on in general. A lot of them keep reassuring us that they're doing okay in Bamako, and that I think for the most part they feel pretty safe with where they are in Bamako right now. So
good. And we were talking about the Tuareg people. I know you didn't get to travel up north because these tensions did exist there. We actually spoke with Professor Smith here, who's familiar with the Tuareg people, and he even had an encounter with a Tuareg leader in France. And so I want to play this clip of Professor Stephen Smith here at Duke talking about his encounter with one of the leaders of the Tuareg liberation movement.
I met on the 4th of December Bilal al-Sharif in Paris. Very interesting to see that he would come in full Tuareg paraphernalia, so it was biting cold, as you can imagine, but he would still have his turban, and he would be in his tubu, a Tuareg outfit. He is a secessionist. He didn't want to speak to the Malian government. The Prime Minister the same day was in Paris, so the French tried behind the scenes to bring the two together. And he wouldn't, because he said that he had issues with the jihadists, but he had more issues with the government. Now, after the French intervention, he has changed his mind, and now he's siding with the French, which means a little bit more with the government than with the jihadists. But that is probably a desperate move by someone who was sidelined both by the jihadists and by the central government.
That's Professor Stephen Smith from Duke's African and African American Studies Department. And Professor Hall, introduce us to the Tuareg people. That's Professor Smith was able to meet one of their leaders who's kind of between a rock and a hard place, between whether to side with the Islamists or whether to side with the Malian government. What do you hear about that?
Well, the Tuareg are about the politics of the. So what he's talking about are the distinction between a more or less secular, and this is a little bit of a misnomer, I think, but a more or less secular Tuareg nationalist organization, the MNLA, and these Islamist groups. And it was the MNLA which launched the rebellion in January of 2012. They had representatives in France and in other places. They had a fairly sophisticated media operation. They tried to draw in the support of people across the Western world, certainly, who have traditionally been a source of some support for them. But they were very quickly, once the Malian state collapsed and once they took control of the major parts of northern Mali, they very quickly were ousted by these three different Islamist groups. And many of their members seem to have switched over and joined with the Islamists. So it's not as clear as Islamists versus secular Tuareg nationalists. But they were basically sidelined by that. Now that the French have intervened, and now that the Islamists have retreated from most of the major towns in northern Mali, these MNLA people have attempted to reclaim a position for themselves as the legitimate interlocutors with the French, the legitimate representatives of the Tuareg. And we'll see how that goes. The French seem to be keen on facilitating some kind of dialogue, and I think it's right that if not with the MNLA, there is an accounting which needs to be north. The Tuareg as a people are, the original inhabitants, or certainly among the original inhabitants of the Central Sahara. They're Berber speakers, so they share the same great language family as people in the indigenous people in Morocco and Algeria and in much of North Africa. And they're traditionally and historically pastoralist peoples, semi-nomadic groups who move in and out of the desert according to the seasons, according to rains and pastures and these kinds of things. And they have never really seen themselves as part of the same people as Southern Malians, or as Black Malians, as they might say, who are traditionally and historically sedentary and agricultural. So these, as I was saying earlier, these distinctions and these feelings and these nationalisms that have emerged to express them go back a long way. But it should also be said that probably the majority of Tuareg people, or people that speak the language of the Tuareg, would have great ambivalence about separatism, or about the effort to create a new state, largely because it's hard to imagine how that would work. It's just, as I said earlier, kind of geographical impossibility. There's not a viable Tuareg state that you could carve out of the north of Mali without including a majority of people who were not themselves Tuareg and would not wish to join such a state.
Professor Hall, we just have a couple minutes left here, but if our connection will hold up, I'd like to raise one more point that's important in your book. Is there's a history of the slave trade that lies behind some of these racial tensions, and not, we're not talking about the transatlantic slave trade that we know about here, but the trans-Saharan slave trade. Can you talk about how a history of slavery underlies these ethnic tensions?
Well, this whole region of Africa is a region in which slavery was very important locally. So there is a trans-Saharan slave trade. There's a slave trade into the Sahara itself. Some people from this region even found themselves taken to the Americas. But by far the most important story of slavery was the incorporation of slaves into local societies. So some of societies in this region would have had 50% of the people in them at the status of slaves. This is true for all the sort of linguistic ethnic groups in this region, including the Tuareg, including the local Arabs. But in the case of the Tuareg and local Arabs, and also a group called the Fulani, they developed an ideology that distinguished themselves, the noble people, from those who were enslaved, and they used racial labels to make those distinctions. And when the colonial period began at the end of the 19th century, colonial officials recognized those distinctions as natural and as racial. And in the effort to kind of create a new post-colonial Mali sort of nationalism in countries like Mali and other places like Niger, Senegal, etc., much was made of the kind of Africanness, the blackness of this new nation. And so people like the Tuareg were easily identified as outside of that, in part because they were considered to be slaveholders by nature. They were considered to be traditional people who practiced this internal slave trade and held slaves themselves. And to some extent, I mean, all the peoples in Mali practiced slavery, and all of the sort of political formations had lots of slaves. And that's widely known. I mean, people in Mali joke about slavery, and they call people slaves as a kind of joking insult quite regularly. But it's the racial difference within the Tuareg society especially, which was latched onto by the post-colonial nationalism in Mali and in Niger and in some of these other countries, to sort of basically render Tuareg populations basically outside of the new nations that were being imagined into existence.
Professor Hall, thank you. I think this has been really helpful to get behind the headlines here and understand some of the context of Timbuktu and Mali. So I appreciate you participating in this office hours conversation from California, Stanford University, where you're visiting scholar this year.
That's right. Well, thank you very much.
And Jen Denike, a Duke senior, studied abroad in Mali last year. Thank you for participating in this office hours conversation.
Thank you for having me.
A recording of this office hours conversation, along with many other Duke videos, will be available on the Duke On Demand website. That's ondemand.duke.edu.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.